Welcome everybody to this rather surreal experience of me. I'm Richard Neville and I'm the Mitchell Librarian at the State Library of New South Wales, and it's my pleasure today to present to you really an exclusive talk that we have prepared for the Friends of the State Library. We realise we're a bit distant at the moment, so this is one way of trying to bridge the very unusual times in which we find ourselves. And as long-standing supporters of the library, we've got something special for you today. I hope we do. This is a talk that relates really to an acquisition of a very significant object that we made in May this year. So it's very topical and very fresh and very recent. If you have any questions through this presentation, you can enter them on the little chat button, which you can see at the bottom of your screen, and I will try and address them at the end of the presentation. Now, today's talk is about a silver punch bowl, which was commissioned by Sir Joseph Banks after his return from the Endeavour voyage of 1768 to 1770. And it deals very much, in a way, it's an artefact that deals very much with issues that we have been addressing, I think, through 2020 in terms of the colonisation and exploration of Australia, and of course the impact that Captain Cook's survey of the east coast of Australia has had on Indigenous people. I'm on Gadigal land, and I think I need to acknowledge that this story has resonances to the experience of Aboriginal people over the past 250 years. And I would like to acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal people who may be present today. And I give this talk in the understanding that it's a complex and very difficult narrative sometimes in which we have to tell. Now, I am going to attempt something very clever and share a screen and show a PowerPoint, and then we'll get the talk underway. So here we go. So my talk today is called really All Together, to collect together all the necessaries for so long a voyage. And the talk is about a punch bowl which the library recently acquired. And it was commissioned by Sir Joseph Banks as part of the kind of accoutrements he was planning to take on his proposed participation in Captain Cook's second voyage, which was to be to the South Seas to try and locate the southern continent. And it's interesting, as I said in my introduction, because obviously it relates to many of the, and this is, you can see the punch bowl here. I should acknowledge that these, or many of these photographs you'll see of the punch bowl, were taken by my colleague Joy Lai, and she will tell you, as a professional photographer, if you ever have to photograph a shiny silver round ball, it's an absolute nightmare. So the clarity you can see in these images is entirely due to her skill in a very difficult process. But obviously this story does intersect in a way with the recent discussions we've had around the visit of Captain Cook into Botany Bay in 1770. And if you haven't seen our exhibition on site, I certainly encourage you to do so. Also, you can investigate the 8 Days in Kamay exhibition online, and I'd also encourage you to do that. It's a very interesting and different way of looking at that particular event. Now, I don't think Sir Joseph Banks really needs much introduction, but he was born in 1743. He was wealthy. He was born into privilege, I suppose, born into wealth, but he was also educated. He was adventurous, and he was well connected. And in many ways, had he been on LinkedIn, he would have had more connections, I think, than anyone. He was a facilitator, and he was a great promoter and patron of science rather than a scientist himself. But his youthful participation in the Endeavour voyage was obviously the thing that shot into prominence and really cemented his place in the history of science in England at the time. When he returned from the voyage in 1771, the 13th of July in 1771, he became a kind of instantaneous celebrity, and all English celebrity. And although many these, in terms of the conversations we've had around Cook in this particular year, it was really Banks who took the lion's share of the attention for the voyage. And 1771 and 1772 was a huge year for him in a way. He was lionised. He became a kind of prominent celebrity in England. He's eagerly anticipated participating in Cook's second voyage. And then obviously the year when that was not to be proved to be in early 1772, a huge disappointment. It was also perhaps not his finest year, and nearly everyone who writes about this particular year in Banks's life, from sort of July 1771 to July 1772, reflects upon his, well, perhaps egotism, his willingness to accept celebrity, the fact that he took, to a certain extent, credit for the thinking of and the development of the second voyage, and that his profile significantly overshadowed that of James Cook, who diligently and without fuss soldiered away preparing for the expedition. You know, perhaps because of his class, he was, perhaps because of his wealth, perhaps because he was, in fact, a very sociable and charming young man. And at this stage, he was 28, 29 or so. Perhaps because he was introduced and became friendly with George III. He was taken to meet George III in August 1771. The Endeavour voyage is very much seen as his, despite the fact it was largely Cook's achievement. He sat for two portraits, and you can see these on the screen now. Joshua Reynolds, who was then the most sort of illustrious portrait painter in England at the time, made the very kind of noble portrait of him. You can see on the left, and the globe alluding to his travels. He's actually doesn't actually allude to his Pacific voyages, but in fact his later Icelandic voyage. And Benjamin West in the middle, you can see, has taken the model of the Grand Tour portrait and encased Banks with the finds that he made in Europe, that he made in the Pacific. And indeed, at the far right, you can see the traditional Grand Tour portrait that wealthy young British lads would make into Europe to absorb sort of Western civilization. And obviously the kind of classical allusions predominate in those portraits. Well, West, rather cleverly, I suppose, or has taken the basic format of that model and overlaid it with what he found in the Pacific. His reputation, however, was not entirely without challenge. As soon as he landed in England, he kind of entered into the social whirl. Lady Mary Coke wrote in her diary, the most talked of at present are Messrs. Banks and Solander, Daniel Solander, who was the botanist or naturalist who accompanied Banks on the Endeavour. I saw them at court and afterwards at Lady Hertford's, but did not hear them give any account of their voyage around the world, which I'm told is very amusing. And Dr. Johnson offered to write a Latin motto for the Endeavour ship's goat, and he thought that a happier pen than his might even write an epic poem about the expedition. And shortly after, Banks was elected to Johnson's exclusive club, and Boswell, who also met Banks, said that he described him as a genteel young man, very black, meaning he was tanned, and of an agreeable countenance, easy and communicative, without any affectation or appearance of assuming. Oxford University offered him an honorary doctorate in civil laws, which was the kind of highest honour it could bestow. And in fact, that is really the only degree he acquired throughout his life. But there was this prominence, I suppose, as is the way today, as it was then, attracted a degree of people sort of who wanted to cut him down, possibly. So these prints you can see on the screen, satirical prints which allude to Banks. Macaronis was a kind of slang word for dandies. And you can see here two prints by a man called Matthew Darley, who made these thousands of prints satirising various aspects of British society at the time. The one on the right is particularly interesting because you can see Banks has his feet on the Antarctic Circle on his left foot and the Arctic Circle on his right, and that becomes a kind of, I wonder if that does allude to the fact that Banks was deliberately suggesting that he was heading down to the Southern Oceans. And you can see here another print. These are from the library's collections of the print shop, which was in 39 at the Strand. And right at the top, you can, just in this one, you can see the macaroni that at the top left corner, you can see on display. So Banks, he famously neglected his supposed fiancée when he returned from Tahiti on the Endeavour voyage. There were rumours of sexual activity with Tahitian women, and so while aspects of London society were quite happy to lionise him, others wondered at his morality. Now, virtually as soon as he returned from the Endeavour voyage, both he and Captain Cook were thinking, in fact they had discussed this towards the end of the Endeavour voyage, that really what needed to happen, and the great debate clearly was whether or not there was a southern continent beneath Australia or New Zealand, and the expedition there needed to be an expedition that could actually sail down into the southern regions and see if it could locate any of the land, if there was this southern continent. So the map you see on the screen now is in fact one that Captain Cook put together. It's also in the library's collection, and the yellow tracing you can see on it is actually this he drew in February 1772 and presented it to the Admiralty as the proposed route that he wanted to take to see if he could locate the Southern Ocean. Now, Cook, in fact, they both were agreed that the expedition would require two ships. There was thought to be some danger in just sending one in case something happened. And it seems that there was quiet planning behind the scenes to make this happen with the Admiralty. On September 1771, he purchased two ships, what became known as the Resolution and the Adventure. And you can see the ship in the centre is the Resolution. And this was, according to, by all accounts, one of the greatest of all exploring ships, and was very fit for purpose. It was a sort of bigger version of the Endeavour in a way, but the choice of the Resolution did ultimately, as we will see, become controversial, but it was one of Cook's favourite ships. But Banks, very much in his mind, felt that the expedition was his and that really he had conceived of it. And many years later, when he recounted the sort of gestation of the voyage, he wrote that soon after I returned from my voyage around the world, I was solicited by Lord Sandwich, the first Lord of the Admiralty, and he was a personal friend of Banks, to undertake another voyage of the same nature. His solicitation was couched in the following words: "If you go, we will send other ships." And Banks was kind of, it was an interesting conception of what he thought the expedition was about. When he was defending some choices he made later in that year, later in 1772, he wrote, "When I was asked whether or not I would go to the South Seas again, if His Majesty should think it proper to send ships to perfect the discoveries which had begun in the Endeavour's last voyage, I answered joyfully and embraced a proposal of all others best suited to my disposition and pursuits. And I pledged myself then to your lordship, and have since, by the whole tenor of my conversation and correspondence, pledged myself to all Europe." And I think this is an important point. Banks did see these expeditions as being, obviously the primacy of English ingenuity and intelligence, or kind of, but it was for all of Europe, and it reflects the wide-ranging nature of Banks's correspondence. He had connections all across the European scientific communities. And he says, I pledge myself to all Europe, and not only to go to the voyage, but to engage with me as many able artists as the income of my fortune would allow me to pay as companions for my undertaking, by whose means the learned world in general might reap as much benefit as possible from those discoveries which my good fortune or industry might enable me to make. And so by August 1771, you know, he's only back a couple of months, and it is perhaps no surprise to know that there was fake news in London just as much as there were in 1771, just as much as there is today. That, but fake, but with a twist, I suppose. That Mr. Banks, it was reported in the local press that Mr. Banks is to have 2 ships from government to pursue his discoveries in the South Seas. And again, it wasn't Banks, but it was Cook who had been offered this, to whom this had been proposed, although clearly Banks was seen as someone who would accompany him. And another paper noted that in fact it was 3 ships, and he was going to establish a colony in Tahiti, which was obviously completely untrue. And Banks, I think, lapped up the adoration which many were prepared to give him. One of his correspondents, I mean, one of the fascinating things about this whole enterprise is that the library's collection of Banks papers include a series 6, which is entirely given over to Banks's preparation for his proposed participation in the second voyage, and much of what we're hearing today is actually taken from the Banks papers. And in those papers, there's a letter from one William Sheffield, who was a museum director effectively, and he noted that your first voyage and discoveries will transmit your fame to posterity. A record attended with equal and perhaps greater success in the second voyage will render you immortal. And immortal was a word that Linnaeus had used too. So I think there was a certain sense, in a way, that Banks's ego was getting in the way of sound judgment. Larragay, a letter he wrote to a French friend of 1771, Banks is already fully invested in the idea. And this is actually a very interesting letter because he's quickly summarising the Endeavour voyage and suggesting what's going to happen next. And in this letter, he talks about where they went and what they did. And when he's sailing up the east coast of Australia, he simply notes that they visited many fine harbours, and then records the wreck on the Barrier Reef. But there's no mention of the 8 days they spent in Botany Bay or the 8 days they spent in Kamei. But in this letter, he says, talking about the future, he says, in March next year, we will sail upon a new undertaking. In other words, to go down to the southern polar regions. And he says, oh, how glorious would it be to set my heel upon the pole and turn myself 360 degrees in a second. And I think this becomes important later on, as we'll see when we look at the Punch Bowl itself. Now, Banks, ever the showman and ever the promoter, this is a map that he had caused to be engraved. And obviously Banks's great wealth meant that he could do things that others couldn't. So this is a map that he had an engraver called John Bailey engrave up. And again, it's looking down on the South Pole, which is empty. And in a way, it's a prospectus for where the expedition was about to head. The southern latitudes were empty, and they were going to fill them in. This expedition was going to fill them in. And the other nice thing about this particular map, which is also in the library's collection, is that we actually have, you can see on the left, the invoice for it in the Series 6 of the Banks papers. Now, when he was getting ready for these, he became fully invested in this idea that he was going to go on the second voyage. So much of the latter part of 1771 and early 1772 was spent in these pursuits. And indeed, in January 1772, he complained to a friend that he was being occupied with collecting together all the necessaries for so long a voyage. Now, Banks claims that he spent about £5,000 putting this expedition, or his contribution to the expedition, together. And it's a bit hard to see how he reaches that figure, but it may be some of that may be the salaries, which were quite significant. The artist Joseph Zoffany was going to be paid £1,000 should he have participated. And the annual bill of the about 16 people, the sort of annual wages bill for the 16 or so people he was proposing to take on the voyage came to about $710 a year, £710 a year. So, you know, it's significant sums of money. But the fact that such a vast sum of money was being spent, I think, alludes to the problem that eventually unfolded, that this vast and ambitious expenditure ultimately undid all the planning. It was just simply too much. Now, Banks saw the voyage, I think, very much as a voyage of discovery for what he would have called the natural history. So he wanted to collect specimens, he wanted to collect observations and descriptions of the peoples he encountered, and he wanted to document geological and physical environments. And this, he thought, could only be accomplished with the naturalist, who was clearly going to be Dr. Solander. He wanted 2 astronomers, he wanted another scientist, he proposed to take 4 artists, he felt 2 secretaries, and he wanted 6 servants as well. So the initial proposals were for 16 people, which was unprecedented, really. So the Admiralty, and indeed Cook himself, saw it much more as a geographical expedition of exploration. In other words, to determine the precise location of the southern continent, rather than the sort of broad ambitions that Banks had. And the conflicts that emerged were actually, you know, this was the conflicting ideas around the expedition were at the heart of all the conflicts that finally emerged. Now, Banks's provisioning spree was prodigious. He, in fairness, you know, it was a voyage of 3 years, and I think one also has to admire his courage and really the kind of risk he was taking in taking 3 years out of his life to pursue a very dangerous expedition. But he purchased gross upon gross of beads and trinkets, which he proposed to give to Indigenous people he encountered on the voyage. He purchased combs, perfumes, scents, medicines, wire catchers for birds and insects, a copy of Tristan Shandy for some reason, engravings that I suppose he proposed to decorate the great cabin of the Resolution, from which he had expelled poor Captain Cook, poor James Cook. He was also purchasing scientific instruments, obviously, and he also invested about £248, which is then, and these are some of the invoices for the that we have in our collection for the various things. You can see ivory and wood turning, net makers, hosiery and haberdashery invoices. So these are some of the things in the library's collections of the invoices that he was putting together for the expedition. He commissioned, and the whole commission cost £248, medals, the Resolution and Adventure medals, which are now great rarities, which he proposed to take on the voyage to give to Indigenous people he met along the way. They did eventually, they were taken on other expeditions by Cook, so they were actually used. But I think in the sense that it was felt that these medals would in some way, sort of tools of diplomacy, it does suggest the kind of cultural blindness, if you like, that Banks was travelling with. And he was certainly very surprised when Aboriginal people in New South Wales didn't show any interest in the glass or trinkets that he left in their huts. And I think, in a way, the assumption that an Indigenous person from another culture might be sufficiently impressed by a thing like a medal suggests that he hadn't thought through a lot of what he was planning to do. Now, in a way, so the punch bowl, which we saw in the beginning of this tour, was another thing that was commissioned specifically for the voyage. And it is kind of one of the more bizarre artifacts, I think, that has been associated with a voyage of exploration. It's about the size of a soccer ball, literally, actually, pretty much the exact dimensions of a soccer ball. And I think when you look at it, it kind of it alludes to Banks's desire to how glorious it would be to set my heel upon the pole and turn myself 360 degrees. Now, the bizarre thing about it is that it's actually the world turned upside down, because normally in a globe, the northern hemisphere sits at the top and the southern hemisphere sits at the bottom. In this particular configuration, it is the southern world, that the southern hemisphere sits at the top, and this figure on top has been variously interpreted, mostly as Atlas, and obviously because he's not holding up the world, he's in repose, he's reclining. It's been suggested by Cliff Thornton of the Captain Cook Society. In fact, maybe it could be Aristotle, and Aristotle was, of course, the first person to propose that there had to be a counterbalancing southern continent. Again, we're not really sure what it really, it just seems to be a kind of, these aspects of it can certainly do with some further work. Now, he acquired it from a man, Valentine, and it's a pronunciation I find very difficult to come to understand. To say Valentine Anschutz, who was a clockmaker, a London clockmaker. He was German-born, and a clock and case maker. And this is the invoice for it, which again is in the library's collection. So you can see received of Mr. Banks the sum of £16, which with £8.08 received from Mr. Zoffany is in full for a globular silver punch bowl. And this is clearly the artefact which we have recently acquired. Now you can see there the hand seems very unsteady, elderly, although Anschutz did not die until 1795. But the curious thing about it is that as a clockmaker and cabinet maker, it's unlikely that he would have had the capacity to make this very elaborate bit of silver. So really, its maker remains unknown. It would surely require a very skilled silversmith to create it. It has no hallmarks on it, which is unusual, but not unknown. And as a private commission, it didn't need to be hallmarked. The hallmark is really something that is put on a bit of silver or a bit of gold, precious metal, to prove that it is what it says it is, and to allow the maker to claim authorship of it. If it was a private commission, then that's possibly not necessary. It could be that that Anschutz was really a project manager, if you like, and he facilitated its construction. You can see on it, there's a map of the world engraved, and we'll get onto that a little bit later. It comes apart like this, and it does hold about a gallon. This is my photo, so it's not nearly as skillfully composed as Joy's, and you can actually see me, and you can see the issues with trying to photograph it. It just reflects everything that is within it. It's obviously a very fine bit of silverware, and one assumes that an expert silversmith would have had to have made it. I really am not sure how it has been constructed. I assume it's probably been placed into a mould and beaten into that particular shape, because it is perfectly spherical. And you can see in there, this is the interior of it. You can see the kind of marks of the hammer, of the kind of punch, which would help flatten it out, if you like, and create a kind of globular shape. So it's a very fine and clever bit of silverware, and really we have yet to explore, only having had it fairly recently, how it may have been actually made and constructed. The map upon it was taken, engraved upon it, and I suppose this is the kind of great conceit of the globe, is that it has engraved upon it a map of Australia, a map of the world rather, taken from William Whitchurch's part chart of part of the South Sea showing the tracks and discoveries made by His Majesty's ships. So in other words, a lot of exploration, a lot of previous explorations into the Pacific. And this was actually published the year after the actual globe was made. So this punch bowl was made. Someone assumes that somehow Banks, and it's entirely likely that this could have been possible, knew of the manufacture of this map and used it to illustrate his own, to have it sort of engraved upon his own globe. And if you look at the, you can't really see it, I suppose, on this particular map, but if we look at this view of the globe, you can see Australia is in the centre of this particular photo. You can see there's the coast of Australia outlined with Cook's own voyage, track of the Endeavour voyage, and you can see New Zealand at the voyage that the track of the Endeavour making. So, you know, it is a kind of very, you know, it's a kind of quite a playful sort of thing, and quite an extraordinary idea that one might take this around a voyage of exploration. It's unclear how it was to be hung or how it was to sit in the Great Cabin, but the Banks also commissioned from Mr. Bock a silver hanger and a chain, and one assumes that this was intended that the actual, because it was a kind of globe, the punch bowl could sit within this hanger and then sort of hang from the ceiling of the cabin of the Resolution. It's a very clever, witty, I think, bit of conceit of Banks's behalf to sort of think of this kind of celebration, I suppose, this kind of extravagant celebration of the voyage itself and where they were going to go. Now, unfortunately, of course, the punch bowl never got to probably go anywhere near the Resolution. The story is quite well known. Because of the size of Banks's party, to accommodate it, the Resolution had to be modified, or Banks insisted that it be modified. And virtually from the first, so the decks were lifted and cabins were built, and that turned it into a cranky ship, in other words, a very dangerous ship. And the sea trials were aborted, and the accommodations were removed. Now, Banks had argued that the enlargement of the accommodation for his team was essential because so that he could reap the fruit earned by my voluntarily exposing myself to danger and incurring material expense. So in other words, he was arguing if he was going to put £5,000 into this expedition, then he demanded that accommodation be provided for him, which was appropriate, and so that he could sort of benefit from all these people that he was taking on with him. And that's kind of fair enough in the one sense, but on the other hand, if it made the ship dangerous, then clearly the Navy Board was not going to agree to that. So this was all happening at the end of May in 1772. And the Navy Board, having witnessed the sea trial and seeing that the Resolution was now a cranky ship, wrote in a kind of a private memo that one would have to say perceptively, noted that Banks considered the ships fitted out wholly for his use, the whole undertaking to depend upon him and his people, and himself the director and conductor of the whole, when clearly, from the Navy's perspective, Captain Cook, James Cook, was the leader of the expedition. Cook, who was a much more kind of measured figure, and this is one of his invoices from the library collection, Cooper's tools are necessary to be taken on a long voyage. Cook himself noted that while preparations on the Resolution were in progress, scarce a day went past when she was not crowded with strangers who came on board for no other purpose but to see the ship in which Mr. Banks was to sail around the world. Now, of course, having failed these modifications, the sea trials with these modifications, the ship was returned to the dock. They were all stripped out. The modifications were stripped out. Banks's modifications, accommodations were removed, and apparently he swore and stamped upon the wharf like a madman. But the Navy would not be moved. They were not going to send men to sea in a ship that couldn't be trusted. And Banks, nothing Banks could do, even with all his connections, to reverse the decision. And he then, in a fit of pique, withdrew from the expedition and headed off to Iceland instead. Now, I think it says a lot for his character that, despite the fact he'd had the sort of blow up with Lord Sandwich, who was the first Lord of the Admiralty, despite the fact his relations cooled with Captain Cook, all these relationships, sort of after the initial temper tantrum, were repaired, and really it says something of him, I suppose, that despite these problems he'd had, that he could still maintain friendly relationships with people who he had previously been in conflict with. Now, obviously, this meant what was going to happen to the Punch Bowl, because it clearly wasn't necessary anymore for the expedition. And it seems that the Punch Bowl was sold to his dining club, the Royal Society Club. The evidence, which was an exclusive dining club around the Royal Society, the evidence for this is fairly circumstantial, but it's also not insubstantial. And I think in club records note the purchase of a silver spherical punch bowl from Banks for £26 and 2 shillings in January 1788. And the description accords, seems to accord pretty closely to this particular punch bowl. So it seems that the Royal Society Club had the punch bowl until 1784, but then really references to it entirely cease, and it ended up in an American, a New York hedge fund collector's collection until it was purchased, well, then went into public sale, and then in the, I think last year, 2019 or 2018, then it was purchased by the library in 2020. And that, what happened in those intervening years to the punch bowl are completely unknown. Look, it is an extraordinary artefact. It seems to say so much about the confidence of sort of someone like Banks, the confidence of Europeans in their push into other parts of the world. It says a lot about the whole enterprise of empire, really. And it's also just a really splendid, beautiful thing, which, by greatest good fortune, actually melds perfectly with the library's existing Banks collection. So it's something we're very pleased to have been able to acquire, and I think it's going to be a great source of further investigation and discovery as we bed it down into our systems. So thank you, everyone. And I think we have one question I can see. I don't know if anyone has any other questions, but you can put those into your Q&A. And the question is, it's an unusual object for a paper-based collection. Are there other similar objects in the library? And that's a good question. People often, one of the things about a library is that people tend to think of them as being very paper-orientated. But libraries do, and particularly research libraries such as us, do have small collections of objects that relate often to other parts of our collections. And we do have indeed quite a lot of silverware that is related to Cook's voyages, often very poorly attributed. There seems to have been a whole industry in the 19th century of people saying that they worked for Banks or worked for Cook, and as thanks for service, they were given bits of silver, which often turn out to be completely incorrect. So yes, the library does have objects that relate to its, does have objects that have some historical relevance to its collections. Someone else asked, why is a medal King George, the king of, well, I presume the question is, why does the medal of King George, or the obverse of the Resolution and Adventure medal, is a profile portrait of supposedly George III, but looks like the King of France. There was some comment on the poor quality of the figure of George III, so I think that's a mistake rather than not deliberate. One question is, Benjamin West portrait has Banks doing the Grand Tour. So his Grand Tour was a Grand Tour of the world. Did many young men do Grand Tours of places outside Europe? And no, not really. The idea of the Grand Tour was that you went to Italy, basically, and absorbed, and I suppose Greece, and absorbed from the fountain of Western civilization, the you know, the sort of things that they were to learn from the ruins of Europe. The question, will the Punch Bowl be in display in the future? Yes. Now that is, we are hoping that we're going to have it. We are looking to develop a space in which we can feature the maps collections. One question says, how much do we pay for it? And I think I'd prefer to say that we did pay quite a lot for it. So in terms of its display, we do want to put it onto public display, but we do need very much to construct for it, or to devise some way to ensure that it is secure and safe. So once we have those questions resolved, then yes, the idea, we are very much looking forward to having it on public display. So quite a few questions about when will it go on public display. And another question is, will you, but I think the question is really, will the library be giving more talks like this? And the person says, I hope so. And it is very much our intention to provide more talks like this, particularly as it is so hard for us to meet physically. Then obviously virtually is a great way for us to be able to share our enthusiasm for the library and the library's collections. So yes, the answer to that is yes, there will be more talks like this. Another question is there a record of what Banks took on the Endeavour? Not nearly. I mean, you can obviously glean from the various correspondents and diarists and journalists what was taken on the Endeavour, but there's nothing to the degree that we have records for this particular voyage. So, but close reading of text can reveal an awful lot. And that seems to be the end of our questions. So look, it just really, from my perspective, it's been a pleasure to be able to present to you an artefact that was, been an enormously interesting and fascinating thing to research and look into. It's wonderful that it fitted so perfectly within the library's collections, and we do look forward to sharing it to you with you physically when we can do so. So thank you, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. And I think that's goodbye.